Good afternoon and welcome everyone. This is the 2019 release Subaward template update webinar. This webinar will outline the changes to FDP's 2019 Subaward templates and provide an overview of its key features. Let's start with introductions. I'm Amanda Humphrey, Director of Award Administration at Northeastern University and one of the co-chairs of the FDP Subaward Subcommittee. I'm joined by the woman who makes these templates possible, Laura Register, Assistant Director, Subaward Oversight and Compliance at Stanford University. Laura really leads the way on programming and updating the template functionality. We're also joined by Stephanie Scott, Director of Policy and Research Development at Columbia University and a fellow co-chair of the FDP Subaward Subcommittee. Jessica McDonough, Subaward Coordinator from Dartmouth College, is also joining us as a moderator. Jessica has been working with us to test and QC the documentation for the templates. Jennifer McAllister, Director of Government and Foundation Contracts from Duke University, and Brenda Kavanaugh, Associate Director from the University of Rochester, are also here and will walk us through the new features on the clinical research sample. They've been leading the clinical research sample working group for us. Please feel free to ask questions along the way through the chat feature. We will pause routinely to incorporate your questions. So here's our agenda for today. We're going to walk through the 2019 templates using the cost reimbursement Subaward template. We'll also quickly walk you through a couple of other tools that will hopefully help you to communicate about the templates within your organization, both to other substantive stakeholders as well as to maybe your ITS group if you program your templates. We will also be doing a quick overview of the clinical research sample. That sample, just for clarity, has not yet been posted. We're waiting for one final clarification before we post that template. We hope to have that available in the next week or so. And throughout the webinar, we will be pausing for questions. So feel free to type them into the chat box. So we will provide some high-level information on the process for incorporating data use terms during this webinar, but I just wanted to let everyone know that there will be a separate webinar when the data transfer and use agreement attachment is ready for use. All right, so let's get started with the templates. So just to walk everyone through, we're going to go through the templates using the cost reimbursement. These changes are also applicable to the fixed amount subaward as well as the foreign subawards, unless we say otherwise. To start, the most noticeable change that you might see just from the outset is we did slightly modify the header from the 2018 version of the templates to the 2019 version of the templates. In the 2018 version of the templates, the header read FDP Cost Reimbursement Research Subaward Agreement. And you'll notice we've removed the words research and agreement. The rationale for that is not all subawards are research activities. Some, such as a T award, may be more oriented to training or other activities. So we also looked at how we use the terms subaward and agreement throughout the subaward template, and it seemed that using agreement was duplicative, so we removed that additional word. Finally, one other thing that you will notice is previously in attachment 1, we had referenced the terms as shown above, and we realized that the checkbox on attachment 2 confirms if a subaward is for a research activity. So it was redundant and not always accurate to call out research in the header. So instead, we've relied on that reference to the type of activity in attachment 2 to indicate whether something is for a research and development activity. And then Laura's also highlighting the next change that we made in term 1, which is we had said in the 2018 version of the template that the PTE hereby awards a cost reimbursable subaward as described above to the subrecipient. And so what we've done is we've changed that to the PTE hereby awards a cost reimbursable subaward as determined by 2 CFR 200.330 to the subrecipient. and as described above seem to refer to the header of the subaward. However, it is more accurate to refer to the regulation in guiding the definition of the relationship between the two parties rather than a document header. So we just go back to 330 and let the description of the type of the relationship between the two parties that is reflected in the regulation govern. Moving on to term 2, we added a minor clarification here. So we added, as Laura is highlighting, the phrase breakdown by major cost category. And the rationale for that is that cost reimbursement invoices should include major cost categories because the pass-through entity, or PTE, should be reviewing the invoice to verify allowability of expenses consistent with funding agency terms and approved budget. Major cost categories facilitate this review and monitoring. So we really wanted to emphasize that those major cost categories are part of the review of the invoice and subrecipient monitoring activities. It's one of the key ways you know, if applicable, whether your subrecipient is deviating from their approved budget. Moving on, we're looking now at terms 6 and 9. We made the same change in both locations, so I'll just describe it once. We added 2 drop-down boxes to those terms to allow the contacts to be identified for each the subrecipient and the PTE. So you'll notice that there's 2 places where it says to the PTE's authorized official contact and the subrecipient's authorized official contact. That's the default that's on the templates. But you'll see that there's drop-down menus. So if at the PTE, it's the authorized official, but at the subrecipient, it's the financial contact, you can make that change in your negotiation because roles and responsibilities across the parties may vary slightly. So we wanted to make sure that it was clearly indicated where things go for each of the PTE and the subrecipient to hopefully help make sure that notices go to the right location. While the authorized official should still sign off on the transaction, another party, such as the admin contact, could be the best initial point of contact to initiate those transactions. So we just wanted to make sure that that first point of contact was called out in those areas. Just to go back up to the header, this is one of the places that is slightly different in the cost reimbursement versus the fixed amount subaward. Specific to the fixed amount subaward, we changed that header from FDP Fixed Price Research Subaward Agreement to FDP Fixed Amount Subaward, because a fixed price is a FAR term. So if you go to FAR 16.2, that is applicable to contracts and subcontracts issued under the FAR. However, these subawards and these templates are subject to uniform guidance. So we looked at the uniform guidance regulation governing this, which is 2 CFR 200.332, which governs grants, cooperative agreements, and subawards. And that refers to a fixed amount subaward. Thus, we updated the nomenclature for consistency and accuracy. Jessica, do we have any questions?
We do not have any questions at this time.
Fantastic. So we have one quick change on attachment 1. And that is down in the Program for Enhancement of Contractor Employee Protections. We deleted a single word. There was, as some of you may remember, in 2017, this program went from being a pilot program to being a permanent regulation. We had removed the word pilot in 2017 from most of this clause, but we missed one reference to pilot. So we just removed that to make sure that everyone was clear that this is no longer a pilot program. Moving on to attachment 2. This is where I think maybe, Laura, it would be helpful for you to, I'll go through this first change, and then maybe, Laura, you can show, go up to the top and plug in NIH, and then we can go through the new NIH specific section. So you'll notice that we put the Awarding Agency Institute, if applicable, up here in the required data elements. And that's just for users that want to indicate the specific institute within NIH or even NSF specific programs, because there may be variable terms or conditions, adding it to this section would allow users who append the NOAA to forego the additional data entry. And just a note, anywhere that we talk about changing the fields, we've also updated them in our field crosswalk, which we'll show you after this part of the webinar. And I just want to point back to the subaward is research and development checkbox that is there at the top of the top section. That ties back to our removal of the word research from the face page, because we are relying on this section here that clearly indicates if a subaward is for research and development. So I'll go through the data sharing and access section, and we had this section have a checkbox that said check if applicable. However, it was clear to us that that really wasn't answering people's questions in a clear, concise fashion. So we did make a couple of minor tweaks. We mostly removed language and changed the structure of the section by removing check if applicable and removing or in the special terms below. What we wanted to do was clarify this section to ensure users were clear on when the project could rely on the NOA, Notice of Award, or the various grants guidance documents from the federal awarding agencies, and versus when to append a specific plan. So what we did is we added a drop-down sentence, and that last sentence only appears if you select attached or provided upon request. So this section here defaults to no additional requirements, which means that you rely on the federal awarding agency's standard terms and conditions as shown in the general terms and conditions 1 through 4 above, which tie back to the relevant agency policy. If you select that there are additional requirements, you can indicate that they are attached or that they are provided upon request. And that additional half of the sentence comes up when you click outside of the box. Okay. And then oh, sorry.
Oh, you want to do questions first?
Sure, that sounds great.
Okay, we have a couple. First is, will the R&D checkbox be unchecked by default so the preparer has to knowingly check the box?
We did leave that box checked by default, which means that unless you uncheck that box, it will indicate that it is a research and development award, because a preponderance of the subawards are research and development. A vast majority, like 98%, are going to be for research and development. So we wanted to maintain that reduction of administrative burden while also balancing that with really making people look at that specific checkbox or think about how they're using that.
Thank you. And the next is, can you provide guidance on how to use the current template for non-FDP members like DOD or AHRQ as a prime?
That's a great question. Thank you. So while DOD as a bucket writ large is not one of the options, there are several Department of Defense related agencies up there. Laura, I think this is a great question to go back up to the top and look at the menu of what the available specific agencies are. So related to the Department of Defense, we have the Army Research Office, the Army Medical Research and Material Command, the Air Force Office of Scientific Research, the Office of Naval Research, and depending on, adjacent to, because sometimes they're administered by ONR, we have NASA, and they're not administered by, but they're kind of a related agency, Department of Homeland Security. Those are all of the FDP member institutions within the Department of Defense and adjacent agencies. So those are specific options that you choose. DARPA, IARPA, any of those other ones are not specifically FDP members. So that's where you would do other, type in agency, and then you could use this for a grant or cooperative agreement under DARPA, IARPA, or some other that I'm not thinking of Department of Defense related. Now, you'd also asked about AHRQ. That, you know, again, they are not specifically a member of FDP, while NIH is, and they both roll up to the Department of Homeland Security. So to try and make things a little bit easier, especially because they follow the same financial conflict of interest rules and regulations, there is a separate drop down in the bottom for other HHS agency, and then you can type in AHRQ, and it will pre-populate the pieces that we know are really that AHRQ and HRSA follow, which would be the financial conflict of interest section.
Thank you.
Okay, so Laura, I think this would be a great time to, populate the NIH. And if you maybe want to walk us through a couple of the enhancements that go with this, that would be fantastic.
Great. So I've selected NIH, I've run the template, and so when I go down to attachment 2, it'll show all of the NIH terms and conditions. The major change this year is relative to, there's an NIH section now, and there's also the work involving human or vertebrate animals, and we'll get into this a little bit more, but you'll notice in the human and vertebrate animals section now, there is an option for human subject exempt. And that will obviously remove your separate human subjects. And if you select human subjects, it'll remove your exempt. So that's the primary change in the human and vertebrate animals area, in addition to some changes we've made in the language, which Amanda will go over in just a minute. The very large change is that if you select NIH, there is now this additional section for terms and conditions where you will indicate if the clinical trial indicator in the PT's NOA is stated as no or yes. If it is stated as yes, then you're going to indicate whether or not the work being performed by the subrecipient is actually a clinical trial or not. And if it is, then you're going to want to consider the use of the attachment 2B, which we'll go into when we preview the new clinical trial template. As before, multiple PIs has now been moved down from the first page of the attachment 2 down into the NIH section since it is NIH specific. This functionality has not changed. If it is subject to a leadership plan, then you can select to make it available upon request or include it as part of attachment 6. Also, the COC language was now incorporated. It's no longer an add-on in the additional terms. It's going to show up as well when you select NIH.
Fantastic. And one thing too that I want to point out that Laura did to help us all is if you have selected this subaward will be subject to a leadership plan, and then you have the second box below, and if you say, oh, whoops, I got it wrong, this is actually an NSF award, not an NIH award, that box will now disappear when you change the funding agency on the first page and hit run template again. Before, that box would have just stayed there like a little ghost hanging out in that section, and now Laura's updated the language so that it just goes away.
So you no longer have to back it out every time?
Yep. So super helpful. Thank you, Laura. So to go back up and actually walk a little bit through the work involving human or vertebrate animal section, we wanted to point out, in addition to the menu choices that Laura walked you through earlier, there was one other thing that we wanted to call out, and that was we made a couple of minor tweaks to the language based on the fact that there are more instances now, because especially the change to the SIRB policy for NIH, we wanted to make sure that the language accurately reflected that. So what we really did was add the appropriate IRB and or IACUC. So the parties would then decide which was the appropriate IRB or IACUC. When you select human subjects, it will say, you know, that basically the subrecipient's using their own IRB and will send the approval or will provide it upon request, or This project, it has a single IRB, which is why you're not requesting a copy of the IRB, so not required for the following reason. And then you'll see that there is an SIRB designated, or the PTE is acting as the SIRB. So to kind of align with that addition of the SIRB as an option, we added that appropriate IRB and or IACUC. And then we just changed the word maintain to follow current and duly approved research protocols, because especially if you are a subrecipient and the PTE or another entity is acting as the SIRB, that SIRB will be the one that is maintaining the protocol, and you will just be following whatever the current and duly approved research protocol is if you're the subrecipient. So just to make that clear. And then we added, if subrecipient is using its own IRB and or IACUC, subrecipient certifies that its IRB and or IACUC are in full compliance with applicable state, federal laws and regulations. So again, just making sure that we appropriately aligned the responsibility versus when an SIRB versus a subrecipient's own IRB is being utilized. So you'll notice, I'll come back up to human subjects data, but I just wanted to point out, as Laura mentioned before, multiple PI moved from page 1 of attachment 2 down here to page 2 of attachment 2, so that we consolidated all the NIH specific terms and conditions in the same section. With respect to data sharing and access, this is again a section where we had a checkbox, check if applicable. So we removed the check if applicable, and what we did instead was to put this drop-down menu here that would clearly indicate not applicable, applicable, or human subjects data will not be addressed in this agreement. And one of the reasons that we changed it to human, so if you check that it's applicable, you'll be able to select the direction of the data flow, and you'll notice this human subjects data, you can either select via a separate data use agreement or in attachment 7, whereas last year's version of the template said as shown below, and we just had people copy and paste various pieces of language in there. While we are not quite ready to proceed with the data use terms and conditions specific piece of the subaward, we are very close, and that should be released hopefully in the next month or so. But really what we're trying to do here is prepare for that by moving it to attachment 7. So we, by moving it to attachment 7, we wanted to emphasize that this is a pilot, that some institutions may or may not choose to incorporate the data use agreement terms and conditions or leave them off entirely. And we felt that it was easier to do that and really let people pilot that in by moving it to a separate attachment. Just kind of worked out better for spacing as well. For the time being, what we would typically recommend is you can either attach a separate data use agreement as your attachment 7, or you can notate instead of attachment 7 as shown below in the special terms box. So hopefully we'll get that up soon so people are able to use that. So the 2 options for certificate of confidentiality language were available last year for members to pilot as a separate Word document, and then people basically just chose and copy and pasted some language into the additional terms box. Now that we've piloted that language for a little bit, we reached out to members, we got some input and some thoughts on the language and how to proceed. And so we ended up going with the shorter piece of language that we had piloted because most users felt this language was the most appropriate and easiest to follow. This section will only appear when NIH is selected as the federal awarding agency. So if you pick USDA or something, you will not see this piece of language. And then Laura walked through already the clinical trial section indicator. So I think those are all the changes to attachment 2. Jessica, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. The first one is, if we're using this template for non-research, can you offer guidance when the terms and conditions populate for general RTC terms?
So if you are doing it for a non-research purpose, the grants policy statement may still apply, even though it may, like for NIH, the grants policy statement applies even if it's not a research activity. If in your specific use case that those research-related terms and conditions would not apply, you can just blank out that section. You can go in and delete it. Even though it will auto-populate, you can still manually delete it out after you hit Run Template.
Thank you. The next question is, do institutions provide, or what do they provide for documentation if they're under a single IRB?
That's a great question. I think it will vary depending on the circumstance and how the pass-through entity chooses to manage that. They can elect to attach a copy of the SIRB. They can say that's going through the IRB offices, so we're just going to let that stay over on that side of the house. However, the institution decides as the pass-through entity that they want to manage it is up to them.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we did not make any changes to attachments 3A and 3B. Moving on to attachment 4. We did make 2 changes. The first is related to the carryover section, and Laura, I'll let you describe this.
So the major change in this section is this little pop-up that states that carryover instructions and requirements are as stated by the Federal Awarding Agency guidance or as shown below. And the reason is to bring some more clarity into the carry forward restriction. So if, for example, the sponsor allows carryover up to 25% and then requires a restriction, the pass-through entity can either follow exactly what the sponsor says, or depending on their capability, they can add in additional terms below as to how that carryover restriction works, just to make sure that we have some clarity, because the previous language was a little ambiguous as to if it was entirely restricted or not.
Thank you, that's super helpful. And you would not believe how many times it took us to get that to go the way that it flows now. We definitely played around with that. The other change that we made here is under the other reports section, and that change has to do with the invention reporting statement. So we added a change to the notification requirement, and we clarified that the subrecipient agrees to notify both the PTE's contact person and the government in iEdison within 60 days after subrecipient inventor discloses inventions in writing. So the reason that we made that change is because subrecipients are required to report in iEdison and to the PTE. Those are 2 separate obligations and 2 separate reporting requirements, because you always have to report your invention directly in iEdison when you're filing for your patent. And then separately, there's the kind of award management and closeout piece for the award itself, which flows through the pass-through entity. So what we really were hoping to do is clarify the obligations to report to both the Federal Awarding Agency through the appropriate portal, and also to notify the PTE, so that when the project closeout happened, you kind of had an accurate, appropriate list of the inventions that needed to be included in the final invention statement. Any questions?
Yes. Are there any ramifications if you extract or delete attachment 3A and 3B and then insert completed versions with the coding of the templates?
Not any longer. So once you go ahead and select your sponsor and then you run the template, then you can extract pages. The former iterations had issues with that because the code would keep running. That's why we have that run button. And once you've done that, you can then extract any pages that you need to.
Thank you.
Great. Attachment 5 and Attachment 6, there were no changes there. We're just going to briefly show you that I don't think we actually even put it in. Is there an Attachment 7? Or is it just a header?
There is not currently an Attachment 7 because we do not have the DUA to put in yet.
Perfect. So that will be, when that goes as a separate document, that will be a completely separate PDF. That's right. So the final version of that will hopefully be posted soon, and it will include additional materials, including guidance. And this will be an optional attachment in which institutions may elect to incorporate the data transfer and use terms. Attachment 7 will be aligned with both the templates and the FDP DTUA to reduce conflict and align expectations without replicating terms. So that is still, we're just going through the comments that we received from the community before we finalize and make that Attachment 7 available. There will be a separate webinar for that. Laura, before we move on to the clinical trials piece, I just wanted to quickly go through the unilateral and the bilateral modification with checkboxes to let people know about a few changes there.
Amanda, would you mind if I answered one FAQ that I saw come in?
Yes. Please
Okay,
do.
hi, it's Stephanie Scott. I saw a question come in, believe it or not, regarding MOUs when there is work being done with vertebrate animals with collaborating institutions. And the question came in saying, hey, can we include MOU language in the template, or think about including everything so that we just have one agreement? And I just wanted to point out that this is a very hot topic right now, a very complicated answer to that. And for more information about that specific question, you should go to the FDP website, because we recorded a webinar on that very exact topic just a few weeks ago. And that recorded webinar is on the website at thefdp.org, and you want to go to the IACUC subcommittee page where we posted that webinar. It's also posted on the homepage of the fdp.org in the announcement section on the right-hand side, where you'll see a link to that. So we are exploring that topic about MOUs. The current language that's in the subaward does not meet the expectation for an MOU. We do go into this at length during that webinar, and stay tuned for that topic, because we are going to give future emails and more information about next steps on that particular topic. I just wanted to throw that out.
Thank you. All right, so we'll start with looking at the bilateral sub-award amendment template. You'll notice that there's now two options here on the website. There's a bilateral sub-award amendment, free text only, and then one with preset options and text. The reason for adding the second option was really to help institutions that pre-program their templates. Our goal by adding that specific PDF was that it will be easier to program in like a no-cost extension and have it check the no-cost extension box and plop in that end date, kind of in line with the unilateral sub-award amendment template. And then where you need to add in free text, you can. You can absolutely use the one with the preset options and text for, you know, if you're manually filling in the templates. Ultimately, we don't mind how you use them. We just wanted to provide an option that would give some consistency there. So if we just open that one up really quick, we can see that we did make a couple of minor changes here. So just being really consistent with the header from the agreement itself, we've taken out the words research and agreement, and we also changed it from FDP research subaward agreement amendment to just FDP amendment. And by broadening the header and some of the field names, we tried to create some latitude to use the amendment template for other types of FDP templates, including the clinical trial sample, including if you somehow wanted to use it for a federal contract, you could. We really just wanted to try and pull it back so that if you wanted to program one thing into your system, hopefully this would be a reasonable option for you. We also removed a field called effective date. Various institutions were using this field differently. It ended up causing confusion without adding value. So our guidance is if an action requires an effective date, such as a change in PI, where the PI changed on Monday from PI A, then on Tuesday it was PI B, you should clearly state that effective date in the body of the text to the modification. We also added cost share radio buttons to reflect if cost share is applicable to the subaward. The no option is automatically selected since cost share is not applicable to most FDP subawards, but we thought it would be good to keep that clear from year to year. And here you'll see the options that we put into this new instance of the amendment template. So you can check if you've got carryover, you want to set that out. If you want to add additional things or change more things that are listed there, you can always check the other box. You can always type in clarifications to the text above by typing in the other box below. So we just hope that that will be useful for people. And then just looking quickly at the unilateral template, there was one minor tweak to a piece of language related to carryover. So previously, we had a statement that in the event funding was not fully expended by the subrecipient during the prior period, the amount for the prior period is hereby reduced to equal the subrecipient's final invoice. I think that there was some questions about obligated versus authorized and when how to read that sentence. So we added the clarification at the end of the sentence that says, unless prior approval is granted by the PTE, and removed the words amount for the prior period is hereby reduced to equal the subrecipient's final invoice. So we're hoping to clarify that while those funds have not been de-obligated by the pass-through entity, they are restricted for use in the current period until or unless you receive a prior approval. Jessica, do we have any questions?
We do have one question that came in, noticing that the footer on the cost reimbursable template is different than the footer on the amendment template, when wondering if that would be updated.
Yes, we do actually have that already updated and ready to go, but we're waiting for the last clarification for the clinical trial agreement, and then we were just going to update the website one time with everything and send out one note letting everyone know that all the kind of clean documents are up and ready for use. While we are here, I'm sensitive to time because I want to give enough time to Stephanie and Jennifer and Brenda. I just want to let people know to please also use our other resources. We, down toward the bottom of the web page that Laura was just on, we have a crosswalk and a major changes document to communicate updates to the templates at your institution. The major changes document is especially helpful for circulating the new templates to, say, your OGC or party responsible for approving templates because it walks through the substantive language changes. If you program your templates, please send your ITS group the crosswalk and the major changes document because it should really streamline their updates in your system. We try and document exactly what fields and language have changed so they can make the changes in your system based on those two documents. All right, so now I will hand it over.
Okay, so this is Stephanie here, and we are going to talk about a brand new guidance chart to help you determine which template to use for what purpose. So Laura, if you could put up the subaward template guidance chart. Excellent. Okay, so the main purpose of this chart is to help guide you to select the appropriate FDP subaward template or sample. And so the main point that I want to get across to everyone is that the scope of work and the payment model is what should drive the appropriate template to select. And so I'm using the term template and sample interchangeably here, but I want to make very clear that we have templates. And when we refer to a template, that means you can't edit anything except where we point where you can include additional terms. And when I use the term sample, there's more flexibility to make edits depending on what's necessary for that project or for your organization. So part of the reason that we created this new chart was to clarify some of the confusion around NIH-funded clinical trials and the best subaward template or sample to use for various circumstances. So again, I'm driving home this point. It's the statement of work and the payment model that drive the pass-through entity's decision for choosing the best template. It's not just the fact that the subrecipient is conducting a clinical trial. So what I'm going to do is very quickly walk through this chart and the different columns that are here. The first column, we are saying the federal sponsor award type. This is the prime award. Is it a federal grant or cooperative agreement or a contract? The second column is the payment model. Is it cost reimbursement? Is it fixed rate? And when I use the term fixed rate, I'm talking about a per patient or a per enrollee, per subject enrollment model. The third column is the subrecipient type. Is it domestic or is it foreign? The fourth column is the statement of work, and this is a very important column because we're describing here the statement of work of the subrecipient. Are they working with animals? Are they working with human subjects? Are they working with human subjects, but it's not a clinical trial? Are they working with human subjects, but it's a traditional clinical trial? I'll get to that in a minute. The fifth column is what is the flag in the notice of award if indeed you're working with an NIH as the prime award. And so in section 4 of the notice of award, it will state there will be a flag, yes, it's a clinical trial, or no, it's a clinical trial. And this relates to that new field that Laura showed you in the templates. The next column is template or sample to use, where we make the recommendation of which template you should be using. And then finally, we have a column for some additional notes and instructions and guidance in terms of what you should do for each of these different circumstances. So given that there are different types of clinical trials, at the bottom of this guidance chart, and Laura, you could show the bottom a little bit, we provided a glossary at the end of this chart where we define traditional clinical trial. And when we say traditional clinical trial, those are the clinical trials that are involving a drug or a device and the enrollment of subjects versus a non-traditional trial, such as a biobehavioral study or a prospective basic science study that involves human participants. So studies with a billing model that are fixed rate should use the new FDP fixed rate clinical research sample that Jennifer and Brenda are going to go through in a minute, regardless of whether the study is a clinical trial or not. So the billing model is driving the use of that fixed rate clinical research sample. So in general, we're strongly encouraging the use of the FDP fixed rate clinical research sample for any study where you're working with a per patient or a per enrollee budget model defined as fixed rate. In those rare circumstances where the pass-through entity must use a cost reimbursement template for a traditional clinical trial, remember, traditional is drug or a device, then we ask that you include an extra attachment to that template, which is what we're calling attachment 2B, which is a separate attachment meant for NIH multi-site clinical trials, which Jennifer and Brenda are going to review. And that attachment 2B includes terms related to confidentiality, safety reporting, HIPAA, PHI, warranty, termination and suspension, to name a few. So finally, I want to point out that the FDP does not have a template that contains both a cost reimbursement and a fixed rate billing model, what we sometimes like to refer to as a hybrid billing model, a hybrid template. If you, Laura, let's go to page 3 of this chart. It's just one up. Oh, you went to page 5, go to page 3. There you go, perfect. So you'll see the second to last row. I mentioned hybrids. You know, if you have a payment model with cost reimbursement and fixed rate invoices, that we don't have such a template. And so as Jennifer and Brenda are going through, we're going to go through the rest of this as they're going through the new sample. So I'm now going to kick it to Jennifer McAllister to review the new FDP fixed rate clinical research sample.
One quick thing before we transfer over, for those of you who've asked questions about additional programming that can be put into the templates, we probably won't mention it here. We'll go ahead and add it to our list of suggestions that we can go over with the template working group to see if those updates can be made.
Thank you. Do we have any questions?
None that are available right now.
Excellent. Okay, go for it, Jennifer.
Thanks, Stephanie. This is the first redrafting of the clinical sample since its inception in 2016. We did make some minor changes in an interim version last year to update some of the federal changes, but this year we focused on overhauling the entire agreement in both content and format. One of the changes you'll notice right away is that we changed the title of the document from clinical trial to clinical research. We recognize that there are examples of clinical research projects that could benefit from the fixed rate payment mechanism and some of the additional human subjects terms, but institutions were reluctant to use the sample because of the title. So we've rebranded it so that it can be used for a broader purpose. You will also notice that the format is very different from the previous version. We had many lively conversations about the best format to present the clinical sample in, and we landed on a split format. So everything but the attachment 2B will be in the traditional PDF smart form and is not editable, as is the case with all of the other templates. But attachment 2B is editable, and because clinical projects are often complex and may require additional terms. So we're releasing the 2B as a Word document to allow for red lines, which isn't a function that's available in Adobe. A suggestion that we have for streamlining review of your subrecipients would be to provide them with a red line of any changes you made to the FDP version of 2B so they could focus on reviewing only the changed language. We've also moved all of the clinical terms that were previously in various attachments all to attachment 2B to make it easier for you to edit those. We worked really hard to align the clinical sample with all of the other FDP templates in as many areas as we could. So you will only find a few areas of deviation on the main part of the template, and each deviation is for a specific purpose. On the clinical sample, you will see that the financial information has changed a little bit. We changed the amount funded this action box to a drop-down where you can choose to either put a ceiling amount if your institution needs that figure in order to issue a PO, or you can reference the payment schedule for funding information if that's your preference. We are still waiting for feedback from NIH on this change to the field, and we were hoping to have an okay by now, but we have not gotten that yet, so we can't release the sample until we hear back from them. As of today, we still don't have an answer, so we are pushing to get one, and we're hoping that we'll get one soon so we can go ahead and release it. You'll notice in the sample that if you select under number 2, if you select that you don't want invoicing, all of those invoicing terms will now go away, so you won't see those anymore. And they will reappear if you put the standard invoicing back in. A couple of other highlights to the changes in the PDF part of the agreement that we made. The clinical trial indicator is a little different on this version because presumably you are going to be doing something clinical. So if you go to the clinical trial box, you can mark yes or no. If you mark yes, you will have the option to say that it is either a clinical trial that the sub is doing or it's clinical research, not a clinical trial. And then on attachment 4, the requirement for the certificate of completion has been removed since this is not a fixed amount subaward. So we just got rid of that altogether. Now I'm going to pass it over to Brenda Kavanaugh to discuss the changes to attachment 2B.
Thank you, Jennifer. Laura, if you could bring up the 2B, that would be great. So remember, the attachment 2B is where all those clinical research related clauses would be, and this is the form that you can edit. We understand that every clinical trial and clinical research is different, so we've made this form a Word document and therefore it's editable. The highlights of the changes in this attachment are that we did general edits and cleanup of the terms that we defined in the previous version. We added a field to indicate if there was a separate data coordinating center, as you can see on the screen. We've added a study drug indemnification checkbox, which indicates whether the sponsor is providing the drug or not. And we have enhanced the HIPAA language in this attachment. We've removed the electronic signature and record clause. We felt that was no longer needed. And we've updated the termination language to align with the fact that this is a fixed rate payment mechanism. The entire agreement section has been completely redrafted. We have also created a new guidance document on the use of this sample with FAQs to assist you when drafting agreements. There's useful information on when to use this sample, how to draft payment schedules, cost reimbursement versus fixed rate, and how to manage other types of payments, such as startup costs. We really are hoping that more institutions will adopt this sample. And again, we'd like to clarify to everyone that if you're making the request at your institution to adopt this sample, please reiterate to your leadership that attachment 2B is editable. Do you have any questions?
Yeah, so outside of 2B, is the template, the PDF, editable?
The PDF is not editable. In the spirit of FDP templates, we ask that people do not edit that and just do all their edits on 2B.
And I think maybe Stephanie answered this one previously, but can we include attachment 2B to the standard FDP cost reimbursable template?
Yes, if it's applicable to the subaward that you're issuing, we would encourage you to use this 2B in that circumstance. And Stephanie also talked about the hybrid template, and we just want to stress that we don't have a hybrid template, mainly because the FDP can't really condone the use of a hybrid template. It is the payment mechanism that drives what template you use, and a hybrid would have two separate payment mechanisms, making it very difficult to put those in one subaward agreement.
Thank you. We do have one kind of general question too. Is there an expiration date of the 2018 template?
No. So I think we're encouraging people to continue to move to, or to start to move toward using the 2019 templates, hopefully in the next month or two. And you know, our goal is, unless there's any major changes, to not touch the templates again until 2020. Of course, that all depends on whether there are changes that require us to update the templates by federal regulation. In the meantime, you know, we ask institutions, even if you're FDP members, to just be sensitive to the fact that some institutions may have a longer approval process. Some institutions can just pull the new templates down off the website and go with whatever the most recent FDP template is. Other institutions have a far more formalized review and approval process that can take a couple of months to work through their chain, and or they have to update their whole system in order to pre-populate those templates. So we're really hoping that people can just work toward using the new templates, but be understanding that not everyone's going to be able to be using them right now.
Thank you. Then there's another. How can I incorporate human subjects data language into the FDP template?
Great question. So you would select the human subjects data as being applicable to the agreement, indicate the direction of flow, and since attachment 7 isn't available just yet, one thing that we've suggested to people is either to still copy and paste stuff below and say, this section takes the place of attachment 7 referenced above. So down in the additional terms, you could just copy and paste in the terms and conditions that you're hoping to take the place of attachment 7 in the meantime, and then once attachment 7 is released, you'll be able to use that. The other alternative is to just append a copy of a data use agreement that you would like to use as attachment 7 for the time being. So whichever way you want to go.
Thank you. And why is there a link to an NSF site on the NIH terms and conditions?
A great question. So we get this question often. It is not a mistake. The NSF hosts the research terms and conditions that are agency-wide for a number of federal agencies. So they kind of have an aggregation and a couple of overview tables that show what research terms and conditions are applicable and what regulations from uniform guidance they tie to. So that is a correct link.
I saw another question come in related to 2B that I don't mind taking. It says there are several sections in a clinical rate, the fixed rate clinical research sample that do not always apply, such as study drug. This is not edible, so it makes it difficult to use this sample. Actually, study drug is an attachment 2B, which is completely editable. So remember, the new FDP clinical research sample 2B is editable, and you can use that sample for either clinical trials or clinical research with a fixed rate billing model. So yes, there's definitely going to be situations where you have a fixed rate clinical research study, and yes, you would take out any of those terms that don't apply, such as study drug. So yes, that part is editable.
And Stephanie, I just wanted to add that it is editable, but we still want to encourage people to ask people to refrain from putting in things that other academic and FDP institutions can't accept, like governing law, publication restrictions, perpetual confidentiality. So even though it is editable, just be cognizant of what you're adding into it and make sure that it's not creating burden on the other end for another academic institution.
Any other questions?
One just came in. Since there are no material changes to the amendment, is the use of are you required to use the 2019 template?
Great question. So there were a couple of changes that I understand why you're saying there are not any material questions to the amendment, but I do think we're changing, in particular, the effective date field. I would definitely recommend that institutions move toward that because it does take away something that was a little confusing or inconsistent. If an institution came to me and said, hey, I'm working with this institution, they're still using an old version of the amendment template, I would suggest that they just work with that institution and work it out, because there really isn't a huge change to the amendment template that would really say, that I would really say, hey, a regulation change, you really should be using this current version of the amendment template. I would just suggest to the other institution that eventually they look to adopt it.
Thanks. And lastly, we did have a few questions that came in that I don't think that we'll have enough time for, and how will those be answered?
So what we do is we get a list from the National Academy of Science, who hosts the webinar. They will send us a list of all the questions that were typed into the chat box, and those that we did not have a chance to answer today, we will follow up with you via email.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. And I see we are at time, so does anyone have any closing points that they want to walk through? Okay.
Contact us if you have questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So just write to subawards@thefdp.org if you have any questions. Thank you guys for attending, and happy templating.